Ray Calloway had been counting shoes for 3 months, not because he had nothing better to do, though on the early morning floors of the Harlow Capitol building there were long stretches of silence between the elevator chime and the first rush of footsteps. He counted because it was the only way to measure whether he existed in a place that had never once asked his name. 847 pairs of shoes had walked past him in 91 days of work, and not a single pair had slowed down. Wingtips, loafers, heels so sharp they left small marks on the marble he spent 40 minutes polishing before the sun came up. He watched them pass and felt in some dim corner of himself that he had become part of the floor, something walked across rather than seen. He arrived at 5:14 every morning, which gave him an hour and 46 minutes before the first employees came through security. He had learned early that the building breathed differently before it filled with people. The HVAC system hummed at a lower register, the elevators stood open and waiting like empty mouths, and the light that came through the east-facing windows on the 22nd floor had a pale amber quality that he had never seen duplicated at any other hour. He started with the conference rooms. The large one at the end of the hall, the one they called the boardroom with a capital B, as though the word required ceremony, he saved for last, because it was the most difficult, and because he liked to end the hour in a room with a view of the river. That particular Tuesday, the boardroom required extra attention. Someone had taped a seating chart to the door, a precise rectangular diagram with 9 labeled positions around a long oak table and a small notation at the top that read, "Quarterly Review, all shareholders present." Ray peeled the tape carefully so as not to damage the door's finish and set the chart on the credenza inside. He straightened each chair to match the diagram. He wiped the whiteboard, replaced the dry erase markers in their tray, and polished the glass surface of the table until it reflected the ceiling lights like still water. He worked without music, without podcasts, without anything except the sound of the cloth against the glass and the distant percussion of the city waking up 9 floors below. By the time he finished, it was 6:47. He retrieved his mop bucket from the hallway supply closet and began on the corridor outside the conference rooms. This was the rhythm of his mornings, and rhythm was something he had learned to value above most things because it was the one part of his life that he could still control. Ray was 38 years old and had been running slightly behind for the past 4 of them. He lived in Kensington with his daughter Gracie, who was 7 and had her mother's eyes and her mother's way of tilting her head when she was thinking hard about something. Linda had been gone 4 years now. A Tuesday night, a driver 3 times over the legal limit, an intersection that should have been nothing. Ray had gotten the call at 11:42 p.m. while Gracie was asleep in the next room, and he had spent the next hour sitting on the kitchen floor with his back against the refrigerator, not making a sound, because there was a sleeping child 10 feet away, and falling apart was not something he could afford to do in earshot of her. He had been careful about falling apart ever since. He did it quietly on the bus rides home in the supply closet when the shift ran long in the 11 seconds between when his alarm went off and when he made himself get up. He had tried to build something after Linda. 1 year at the community college nursing program on a partial scholarship, he had been good at it, genuinely good. The kind of student who stays after class to ask questions because the material actually matters to him. The scholarship had dried up at the end of the first year when the program's funding was restructured. He had looked into loans, looked into working more hours to cover tuition, looked at every available angle for 6 weeks before accepting that the math simply didn't work. After that food delivery, parking garage attendant custodial work at Jefferson Hospital, and finally this Harlow Capitol's building maintenance crew, 3rd month in $22 an hour, a plastic ID badge with a photo that made him look like a man who had recently been told very bad news, which was accurate. The apartment on Amber Street had 1 bedroom which Gracie used. Ray slept on a pull-out couch that left a ridge across his lower back every morning. The rent was 6 weeks behind. The screen on his phone had cracked in September, and he had covered it with packing tape and continued using it. In the refrigerator there was usually enough for Gracie's lunches and dinners. Ray ate what was left over, which was sometimes not much, and he had developed a talent for not noticing. Edna Marsh lived across the hall. She was 68, a retired ER nurse from Temple University Hospital, and she moved through the world on a hip that had been replaced 2 years ago and had never quite forgiven the surgeon. She walked with a slight list to the left and wore compression socks in colors that she described without irony as her one remaining luxury. Every morning at 6:30 she knocked twice on Ray's door, and Gracie would already be dressed and ready, because Gracie was the kind of child who took her responsibilities seriously. Edna never accepted money for the child care. When Ray had tried to press the issue early on, she had looked at him with the particular expression of a woman who had worked 30 years in an emergency room and was not interested in negotiating. "I'm watching the child because she needs watching, and I'm here." That's the whole conversation. He had not brought it up again. A year and a half earlier, the West Philly Community Center had run a CPR certification course on a Saturday morning, free open to the public, with a $20 grocery voucher for attendees provided by a local health initiative. Ray had gone for the voucher. He had not expected to find the class useful in any way that mattered. The instructor was a former paramedic named Dave Ostrowski, who had the deliberate, unhurried manner of someone who had seen enough emergencies to know that panic was the enemy of action. Dave had spent 20 minutes on one concept before moving to anything else the first 11 seconds. He explained that when a person encountered someone who had stopped breathing, the brain defaulted to a kind of paralysis, a fraction of a second, that stretched into several seconds while the conscious mind tried to catch up with what the body was seeing. The antidote to this paralysis was not courage in the conventional sense. It was a decision made in advance. You decided before you ever needed it that you were not going to be one of the people who stood still. Ray had listened to this and thought about Linda and about the intersection and about all the moments in the past 4 years when he had not been able to do anything useful and something in his chest had tightened and then, in a strange way, released. He had been the best student in that room. He had left with the grocery voucher and a card that said, "Certified in Basic Life Support," which he had put in the glove compartment of a car he no longer owned, and then transferred eventually to the back of his wallet, where it had stayed. On the morning of the quarterly review, Gracie was still in her pajamas when he kissed her goodbye at the door. She had her mother's hair in a knot on top of her head and a bowl of cereal going soft in milk on the table in front of her. "You smell like cleaning stuff," she told him. He said that was because he cleaned things for a living. She considered this. "Is that what you want to do?" He had pulled his jacket on and told her he wanted to get to work on time, which was not an answer to her question. She let him get away with it the way she often did, because 7-year-olds are more perceptive than adults tend to credit, and Gracie had learned without being taught that some of her father's silences were load-bearing. He took the 26 bus to Market Street and transferred. He was on the 22nd floor by 5:09. By 6:47 he was mopping the corridor outside the conference rooms, and the building was beginning to fill. He heard them before he saw them, the particular percussion of expensive footwear on polished marble, the low murmur of voices carrying the specific cadences of authority, the soft pneumatic hiss of the elevator doors. The people who worked on the 22nd floor of Harlow Capitol were not unkind as a rule. They simply did not register him. He was furniture that moved. He was part of the infrastructure, like the HVAC hum or the motion-activated overhead lights that clicked on a half-second after someone entered a hallway. He had stopped expecting acknowledgement somewhere in the first week. Now he simply worked around them, repositioning the bucket when people needed to pass, moving to the far side of the corridor when foot traffic increased, becoming as small and unintrusive as possible. This was a skill he had developed over 4 years and multiple jobs, and he was by any measure very good at it. Catherine Harlow passed him at 7:16 without looking down. He knew who she was because her photograph was on the lobby wall and on the framed covers of 3 business magazines mounted near the elevator bank, and because her name was on the building. She was 45 tall and moved with the particular economy of motion that belonged to people who had learned never to waste a step. That morning she wore a charcoal gray suit and carried nothing in her hands, which he had noticed was unusual. Most executives arrived clutching phones or coffee cups or folders, as though motion required props. She was empty-handed, and her face was completely neutral, the way a person's face looks when the expression they're wearing is one they've practiced rather than one they're feeling. She walked past him without slowing, her shoes low block heels dark, did not make the sharp, aggressive sound of the stilettos that some of the other women on the floor favored. They made a sound that was deliberate and unhurried and faintly final, like a period at the end of a sentence. Ray moved his bucket 3 feet to the right and kept mopping. What he did not know, could not have known from the corridor, was the particular weight Catherine Harlow carried into that building every morning. He did not know that 6 years ago she had sat in a hospital room in the Kimmel Cancer Center while her husband Thomas lost his last argument with his own body. He did not know that in the 11 months between Thomas's diagnosis and his death, she had restructured her grief into productivity with such efficiency that she could no longer always tell in quiet moments whether she was running toward something or away from it. He did not know that 3 months earlier, her physician had called her in for a follow-up after a routine EKG revealed what he described as a minor arrhythmic irregularity. Nothing immediately dangerous, he had said, but worth monitoring closely, worth modifying her schedule, worth telling someone about in case of emergency. She had nodded and thanked him, and driven back to the office where she had at 2 o'clock. She couldn't move. She had told no one. Not Diana Cole, her legal assistant, and the person who managed the closest thing she had to a personal life. Not her cardiologist brother in Boston. Not the members of the board who made decisions about the company's future, and who would, she knew with cold certainty, look at her differently if they understood that the engine running Harlow Capital had a hairline crack in it that nobody had addressed. Catherine Harlow had built an empire on the principle that information was power, and she had applied that principle privately, and without examining its logic too closely, to information about herself. The boardroom filled at 8:55 for a 9 o'clock start. Ray was still in the corridor when the last of the 9 executives entered. Through the glass panel beside the door, he could see them arranging themselves along the oak table according to the seating diagram he had repositioned that morning. He recognized some of them from the lobby photographs. Warren Slate, the CFO, was at the near end, silver-haired, sharp-suited, with the kind of face that had been handsome once and had curdled slightly into something more aggressive. He had the manner of a man who was always conducting a second private meeting inside his own head, assessing positions, calculating advantages. Ray finished the corridor and began on the alcove near the copy room. At 9:23 he heard the sound. It was not a crash exactly. It was the particular heavy finality of something that had been holding itself upright and suddenly could not anymore. A chair scraping back a body's weight, surrendering to gravity, and then a sound he would later struggle to describe, which was somewhere between a gasp and the absence of one. He looked through the glass panel in the conference room door. Catherine Harlow was on the floor. She had gone down on her left side, one arm folded beneath her. The other hand was open, palm up on the carpet, in the posture of someone who had simply stopped mid-thought. The 9 people at the table were on their feet. He counted the seconds, 1, 2, 3, and nobody moved toward her. Someone said something he couldn't hear through the glass. Someone else picked up a phone. A third person pressed back against the far wall as though increasing the distance between themselves and what was happening on the floor would reduce their responsibility for it. 11 seconds. Ray opened the door. The room turned toward him. He felt the collective attention like a physical thing, the particular bristling hostility of people interrupted in their panic by someone who was not supposed to be there. He did not stop. He crossed the room in 8 steps and knelt beside her. 2 fingers to the side of her neck, the carotid artery pressing through the skin for the pulse that should have been there. Nothing. Her lips had taken on a gray-blue cast at the edges, the color that Dave Ostrowski had shown them in photographs on a projector screen in a community center meeting room 3 months ago, the color that meant the clock had started. He tilted her head back, lifted her chin, cleared her airway, pinched her nose, breathed into her twice, slow and complete, watching her chest rise. Then he laced his fingers together, heel of his hand over the center of her chest, and began compressions. "What is he doing?" The voice came from behind him, high and uncertain. He counted in his head and did not answer. "Somebody get security." A different voice, lower controlled. He recognized it from the lobby photograph's Warren Slate. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. He said the numbers quietly under his breath, not for anyone's benefit but his own. Dave's voice in his memory, "The rhythm is everything. Lose the rhythm and you lose the person." Something struck him across the upper back hard, sudden a burst of pain that traveled up into his shoulders and briefly whited out his peripheral vision. He identified it later as a security baton, though in the moment he could only register the impact and the instinct to curl forward. He did not stop. He compressed through the pain, counted through it, maintained the rhythm while his eyes watered and his breath went short. "Get him away from her." Warren Slate's voice closer now. 15, 16, 17. Out loud now because something about the pain had made it harder to maintain the count internally. He needed to hear it. Fingers closed on his shoulder and pulled. He was stronger than he looked. He had always been stronger than he looked because years of physical work do something to a person that a gym cannot entirely replicate, and he wrenched free without breaking his rhythm. 22, 23. 2 more breaths. Then back to compressions. "You are touching her without permission." Warren Slate had come around the end of the table and was standing 2 feet away. His face had a quality Ray would not forget, not fear, not confusion, not even anger exactly, but something more deliberate and more frightening than any of those things. He was making a calculation. "I have 8 witnesses in this room. Whatever you think you're doing, you need to stop and you need to leave." The words arrived and Ray processed them, not their content but their implication. This was not a man who had lost his composure. This was a man who was building something. He was constructing the narrative before the outcome was known, laying the foundation of an accusation before the person at the center of it had either lived or died. The elevator in the lobby chimed. Somewhere below, someone had called for help. It had taken by Ray's internal count 4 minutes and 30 seconds from the moment he entered the room. He completed the cycle, 30 compressions, 2 breaths, and felt under his hands the sharp, involuntary jerk of Catherine Harlow's chest. Then a sound like water moving through a constricted pipe. Then another breath, ragged and effortful and present. Her eyelids did not open, but her fingers moved a small, curling motion against the carpet, like someone trying to hold on to something that wasn't there. She was breathing. Ray sat back on his heels. His arms were shaking. His back felt like something had been rearranged in it. He looked down at his hands still laced together from the compressions, knuckles white, the pale marks of effort just beginning to flush back to their normal color. The room erupted. People who had stood frozen for 4.5 minutes were suddenly in motion, crowding toward her, saying her name, calling for water, calling for the elevator, conducting the complicated performance of concern that follows inaction. Ray stayed where he was for a moment, crouched on the carpet beside her, until the first paramedic came through the door, and he felt the controlled authority of someone who knew what to do take over the space around him. He stood. He moved back toward the wall. A paramedic, young efficient, looked up from where she'd knelt beside Catherine and scanned the room. "Who initiated CPR?" Ray raised his hand. Warren Slate stepped forward before Ray could say anything further. His voice had recovered its boardroom smoothness. "The situation is being reviewed. Our security team will be in contact." He looked at Ray with an expression that contained beneath its professional neutrality something absolute and settled. "You need to go." No one told him to stay. No one said thank you. One of the paramedics gave him a nod, brief, professional, the acknowledgement of one person who understood the mechanics of what had just happened to another, and then turned back to the work of stabilizing the woman on the floor. Ray walked to the door. He picked up his mop bucket from the hallway. He rode the elevator to the basement level, returned the equipment to the supply closet, and used the staff exit on the side of the building to reach the street. The morning was cold. He stood on the sidewalk for a moment in his gray uniform, watching taxicabs navigate the intersection at 18th and Market, watching a woman walk 3 small dogs toward Rittenhouse Square, watching the city perform its ordinary business with complete indifference to what had just happened 9 floors above it. He took the bus home. Gracie was at school. Edna was watching her game shows with the volume low enough to indicate she'd heard him come in. She looked at him from her armchair, took in his face, his posture, the way he was holding himself slightly off-center to spare his back, and said nothing for a moment. Then, "Sit down before you fall down." He sat at the kitchen table and she brought him coffee without asking, and he told her what happened in the flat, abbreviated way of a person who does not yet have the emotional language for what they've just experienced. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment. "You saved her life." Yes. And they threw you out? Not yet. She looked at him over the rim of her mug. He could see her doing the calculation, running the variables through a lifetime of hospital experience that had given her a particular fluency in the way institutions protect themselves. Go to work tomorrow, she said. See what they do. Don't assume. He did not sleep well. He lay on the pullout with his back aching and replayed the sequence, the sound of her hitting the floor. The 11 seconds, the compressions. Warren Slate's voice, and somewhere around 3 in the morning, he understood that what Warren Slate had said was not improvised. The man had walked around the end of the table, positioned himself 2 feet away, and constructed a sentence that contained 8 witnesses and the word permission. That sentence had been built too quickly and too precisely for the circumstances. You do not produce that kind of language in the middle of an emergency unless some part of you has been waiting for an opportunity to produce it. Ray did not know what Warren Slate's reasons were. He understood, though, lying in the dark with Gracie's soft breathing audible through the thin bedroom wall, that reasons were beside the point. The outcome was the outcome regardless of the reasons. He arrived at the building at 7:50 the next morning. The security guard at the front desk, not the overnight guard he usually checked in with, but a different man he'd seen only twice before, stopped him before he reached the turnstile. "Sir, I can't let you through." He said it without looking up from his desk. "I work here, maintenance 22nd floor. I'm on the morning shift. I have instructions not to admit you." A cold feeling moved through Ray's chest. Not surprise exactly, because some part of him had been bracing for this since he'd walked out of the building yesterday. But hearing it spoken aloud in the flat declarative of a man following orders made it real in a different way. Instructions from who? You'll need to contact Human Resources. Can you tell me? Human Resources. The guard said it again with the gentle inexorability of someone repeating a script they have decided not to deviate from. Ray went around to the service entrance on Arch Street. The night shift supervisor, a man named Gregor, who had been straightforward with him in the months they'd worked adjacent shifts, was coming off his rotation. He stopped when he saw Ray, and his face did something complicated and unhappy. "Wait here," he said. He disappeared into the staff room and came back 11 minutes later with an envelope. The termination letter was 3 paragraphs. The relevant language was in the second paragraph: employment ended effective immediately, reasons cited as conduct incompatible with company policy involving inappropriate physical contact with senior personnel. His final paycheck was inside the envelope. There was no severance. There was a line at the bottom that said he was not to return to the premises and that the company reserved the right to take further action if warranted. Ray read it twice. He folded it along the original crease and put it in his jacket pocket beside the grocery receipt from Sunday and the transit card with $14 left on it. "Gregor." His voice was even. He had practice at even. "She wasn't breathing." Gregor rubbed the back of his neck. He looked at the wall to Ray's left. "I know, I'm sorry." He meant it. Ray could hear that he meant it, but meaning it did not change what the envelope contained, and they both understood this, and there was nothing further to say. He walked out. The morning had the particular brightness of a cold, clear day in November, the kind of light that illuminates everything without warming anything. He walked 3 blocks before his legs decided they were not going to continue at their current pace, and he sat down on a bus stop bench with his hands on his knees and looked at the traffic moving through the intersection. His phone buzzed. A text from a number he didn't recognize, but the message contained his name and the name of the building, so someone from work had sent it. A screenshot from the company group chat. He read it twice. The words were not complicated, but their arrangement was brutal, the casual, confident cruelty of people who have already decided what they saw and have no interest in revision. One person had written that he'd been all over her. Another had used a word he would not repeat to himself. A third had posted a still from the security camera, blurry and poorly framed, that showed him bent over her with his hands on her chest. He understood, looking at the image, that this was not a misunderstanding that could be corrected. Misunderstandings had gaps in them, places where the truth could enter if someone held the door open long enough. What he was looking at had no gaps. It was sealed. He put the phone in his pocket and watched the bus approach. The next 3 days developed a structure that he had not chosen but could not escape. Morning's applications. He went in person where he could: the laundromat on Girard Avenue, 2 diners in South Philly, a commercial cleaning service on 18th Street whose manager had seemed initially like someone who valued straightforwardness. Afternoons, the bus routes that connected these places, the waiting rooms with plastic chairs, the faces of people who pulled up something on their phones mid-conversation and then shifted their posture and said they'd be in touch. The manager of the cleaning service on 18th Street did not pretend. He set down his paperwork and looked at Ray across the desk with the expression of a man who had made a practical decision that he was not entirely comfortable with. "I've seen the situation. I can't bring that kind of attention into a business like mine. I'm sorry. Try somewhere else." Ray said that he understood because he did, and he left. He did not tell Gracie. He told her he was taking a few days off between jobs. She looked at him with her mother's eyes and accepted this explanation with the particular grace of a child who has learned that some of her father's sentences have doors in them that aren't meant to be opened. Edna knew. Edna always knew. She fed Gracie dinner on the second night and didn't ask Ray questions he couldn't answer, and left a plate in his refrigerator with a piece of tape on the plastic wrap that said, "Eat this," written in her large looping handwriting. He ate it at midnight, standing at the counter in the dark, because some habits are easier to maintain when no one is watching. He tried to manage the online situation on the 4th day. It had spread further than he'd understood. There were comment threads. There were people who had formed from 12 seconds of grainy footage complete and confident theories about who he was and what he had done. One thread had his full name, his neighborhood, and a photograph that someone had pulled from an old Facebook account he'd forgotten to delete when Linda died. He read approximately 40 comments before he stopped, because reading them was not making anything better and was doing something to his hands that he noticed when he tried to set the phone down. They were shaking in a way that was not entirely voluntary. He wrote a short, careful response on the only platform where the thread seemed to have originated. He explained in plain language what CPR was and what it required and what he had done and why. He proofread it twice. He posted it. Within an hour, it had been quoted 40 times, mostly by people explaining with varying degrees of confidence why he was lying. He deleted it. Not because he had been wrong about the facts, because the facts were not the point. The point was the story, and the story had been set before he had a chance to participate in it. On day 4, the sickness started. Not dramatically, no single moment of collapse, no useful narrative clarity. Just a headache behind his eyes that persisted through the morning, a tiredness that didn't lift when he sat down and wasn't significantly worse when he stood up. He took 2 ibuprofen and went to knock on 2 more doors and came home when neither of them opened. He skipped dinner because he wasn't hungry and because the refrigerator needed restocking, and he had been running the numbers in his head all day and the numbers were not cooperating. He woke on day 5 with the headache larger and the tiredness transmuted into something heavier and less defined. He got up, got Gracie ready for school, waited for Edna's knock, and went back to the pullout. He told himself this was temporary. He had been tired before. He had been sick before. He had gotten up from both. By day 6, Edna had noticed he wasn't eating. She brought over a container of soup in the afternoon and left it on his counter without comment. He meant to heat it. He lay down on the pullout for a moment first, and the moment extended into the evening, and then into the night. Day 7. Gracie woke at 7 and found him still on the pullout and tried to rouse him. He heard her at some distance, as though through several rooms, and felt the specific animal guilt of a parent whose child is frightened. He tried to get up. His body responded the way a car responds when the battery is almost entirely dead, a sound, a hesitation, and then nothing useful. "Daddy?" She was 7, and she was scared, and she had nobody to call, so she did what she knew how to do. She went into the kitchen and opened the cabinet and found the instant noodles and tried to make something from them. She did not know the proper ratio of water to powder. It didn't matter. She made something warm and carried it to him and set it on the floor beside the pullout and sat cross-legged next to it, watching him with her mother's eyes, waiting. He looked at the bowl. He looked at her face. The effort she had made, the decision she had arrived at on her own without instruction to try to take care of someone, hid him in a place that had not been accessible to pain in 4 years because he had kept it sealed the way you seal a room in a house after a flood. He felt it open. He did not cry loudly. He had practice at quiet. But the tears came, and he did not stop them. And Gracie, who was 7 and wise in ways that should not have been necessary, moved from the floor to the edge of the pull-out and put her small hand on his forearm and left it there without saying anything. Across the hall, Edna had heard sounds she recognized from 30 years of nursing. Not any specific sound, the aggregate of too much silence punctuated by the wrong quality of movement. She came to the door at mid-morning and knocked. Gracie opened it. Edna looked at Ray on the pull-out, his coloring the texture of the silence around him, and did what nurses do when they stop calculating and start acting. She got the thermometer from her bathroom cabinet and took his temperature and looked at the number and called the ambulance before she came back to tell him she'd called it. 103.4 degrees. He told her he was fine. She told him that she had taken temperatures in emergency rooms for 30 years, and that fine was not a word that applied to 103.4 degrees in a man who had not eaten meaningfully in 5 days. She said this in the even practical way of someone who has run out of patience for certain arguments. Gracie sat in the corner of the room with her bear held against her chest and watched the door. Ray did not have the strength left to argue. He lay on the pull-out and listened to the siren approaching, growing louder through the walls of the apartment, and thought about the fact that he had saved someone's life 8 days ago, and this was where it had brought him. He did not feel sorry for himself exactly. He felt the specific exhaustion of a person who has been trying consistently and without acknowledgement for a very long time and has arrived at a moment where the trying has temporarily run out. He closed his eyes. In a different room, in a different part of the city, in a penthouse that occupied the entire 30th floor of a building his mop would never touch. Catherine Harlow was watching a video file on her laptop screen for the second time in 2 hours. The footage was from the boardroom security camera. She had obtained it that morning by calling the head of security with the specific calibrated precision of someone who was done waiting for information to be offered. She had watched it once in full, pausing twice. She was watching it again now, frame by frame, in a section near the middle where she could see herself on the floor and a man in gray crouched over her with his hands moving in a rhythm she recognized from the defibrillator trainings her company ran every 18 months. She watched him take the blow across the back and continue. She watched him take the second contact, a hand on his shoulder, yanking and wrench himself free without breaking the cadence of the compressions. She watched his face in the moments when the camera angle gave her a clear view of it, jaw set, eyes wet, the expression of someone who had reduced the entire complexity of the situation to one necessary thing and was not going to stop doing that thing until it was done. She paused the footage on a frame where he was looking up, not at the room, not at the people shouting around him, but at the ceiling the way people sometimes look when they're counting internally and need to remove the external world from the calculation. She had been told he was a janitor. She had been told he had been let go. She had been told in the diplomatic language of people who manage information for a living that the situation had been handled. She pressed play. She watched Warren Slate come around the end of the table. She watched his mouth form words she could not hear, but could with effort read, and what she read arrived with a cold precision that had nothing to do with the temperature in the room. She saw the timestamp in the corner of the frame. She checked it against the timestamp when the call to emergency services had been placed. Warren had made his accusation 7 minutes before anyone knew whether she would live. She sat with this for a long moment. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, Philadelphia was doing what it did in November, going about its gray, efficient business under a sky the color of old pewter, indifferent to any particular drama occurring in any particular room. She picked up her phone and called Diana Cole. "I need everything on the man in the security footage. Address, employment history, current situation, everything." A pause. "And pull Warren Slate's internal communications from the last 6 months. All of them. Flag anything that went out the day of the incident." She set the phone down and stood at the window and looked at the city and felt for the first time in a long time the particular discomfort of a person who has built something substantial and is only now examining what was used for foundation material. Diana called back in 92 minutes. Ray Calloway, 38, Kensington, Terminated. Phone unreachable. And then at the end, the detail that settled into Catherine's chest like a stone dropped into still water: Edna Marsh. His neighbor had called 911 from the Amber Street apartment 45 minutes ago. The man was sick. An ambulance had been dispatched. Catherine did not make a list of reasons. She did not call her driver. She told Marcus, her head of security, to bring the car around, and she told Diana she was leaving the building, and she did not explain to either of them where she was going, because she had spent 6 years explaining her decisions to people who managed her calendar, and she had in the past 92 minutes arrived at the conclusion that this one was not a decision that required management. She rode to Kensington with Marcus at the wheel and her phone face down on the seat beside her. A message arrived from Diana. Something about a blogger. Something about the story spreading, and she turned it over to read the first line and then turned it back over again. The neighborhoods outside the window changed in the way of Philadelphia abruptly and without transition, glass giving way to brick to weathered siding, the streets narrowing, the light different, the rhythm of pedestrians different, the whole texture of the city reconstituting itself block by block into something older and less maintained and more immediately alive. Marcus stopped in front of a brown building with a metal staircase running up the side of it. Catherine got out. She looked at the building. She told Marcus to wait. She went up the stairs alone. The door to apartment 4B was unlocked. She knocked once and a child opened it, small hair in a knot, wearing a shirt with a cartoon on it. The child looked up at her with dark, measuring eyes and said in a voice quieter than the situation warranted, "You're the lady from the billboard." Catherine looked past her into the apartment. She could see the pull-out couch. She could see the figure on it, the quality of stillness that was not the stillness of sleep. She could hear already the distant two-tone of a siren threading through the Kensington streets. "Is your father here?" she asked, though she already knew. "He's sick," the child said. "He won't get up." Catherine stepped inside. The apartment was smaller than Catherine had imagined, though she could not have said what she had imagined exactly, only that the distance between where she lived and where Ray Calloway lived was not merely geographical, and standing inside his space made that distance measurable in a way that the drive through changing neighborhoods had not quite accomplished. The pullout was against the far wall. A single lamp on the kitchen counter provided most of the light. The walls were the color of old cream, the kind of color that results not from a design choice but from years of paint going slightly yellow in the absence of adequate ventilation. A child's drawing was taped to the refrigerator with 2 pieces of masking tape. Beside the pullout, a bowl of cold noodle soup sat on the floor, the broth gone the grayish color of something that had been warm once and had been waiting too long. She crossed the room and knelt beside him without deciding to kneel. It was the motion the situation required, the same geometry that had governed his actions in the boardroom, and she felt the strange echo of that only after her knees met the floor. His color was wrong, not dramatically wrong in the way that announces itself as crisis, but subtly, persistently wrong in the way that nurses and experienced caregivers recognize a grayness that is not pallor exactly, but the absence of the warmth that living skin is supposed to carry. She pressed her hand against his forehead and felt the heat radiating off him, the way heat radiates from pavement in July uniform, and relentless and wrong for the context. Edna Marsh appeared in the doorway of the narrow hallway wearing her compression socks and an expression of controlled relief that Catherine recognized as the face people make when help has arrived, and they are working hard not to show how frightened they have been. "The ambulance is on its way," Edna said. "He's been like this since yesterday. I should have called sooner." The last sentence cost her something. The admission moved across her face in a way that suggested she had been turning it over for hours, pressing on it like a bruise. Catherine did not offer reassurance because reassurance was not what the moment needed. She looked at Gracie, who had come to stand near the kitchen counter with her bear held at her side now, rather than against her chest, the shift of a child who has decided she needs to look older than she is. "Will you get your shoes on?" Catherine kept her voice even, addressing her directly as she would address anyone in a professional context who needed a clear instruction rather than a soft explanation. "You're going to ride with your dad." The ambulance arrived in 6 minutes. Catherine had been counting without meaning to. The paramedics moved with the efficient physicality of people whose competence lives in their hands rather than their language. They asked questions in rapid sequence: duration of fever, last meal, any known conditions, and Edna answered most of them from the doorway while Catherine stepped back to give them room. One of the paramedics, a man in his late 30s with the flat attentiveness of someone who has learned to notice everything peripherally, glanced up from the blood pressure cuff and recognized her. His expression changed in the specific way of recognition suppressed for professional reasons, and he said nothing except what the job required. On the stretcher under the orange blanket, Ray looked diminished in a way that had nothing to do with size. There is a particular quality to a person who has been running on the reserves of reserves for too long, a kind of used-upness that is more than physical, that involves something harder to name. She had seen it once before in Thomas in the last 3 months, and she did not permit herself to hold the comparison for more than a second. She got into the ambulance. The paramedic who had recognized her did not comment on this. Gracie climbed in after her and sat on the bench along the wall, bare in her lap, watching the paramedic's hands with the focused attention of a child who has decided that understanding what the adults are doing is the safest available response to fear. Fever's 103.8, the paramedic said to his partner at the front. Dehydration, significant malnutrition markers, immune suppression consistent with prolonged stress. We need fluids running before we get there. He hung an IV bag from the hook above and worked the line into Ray's arm with practiced economy. Then quieter, directed toward Catherine. He's going to need a few days minimum. This didn't happen overnight. I know, she said. It was not a deflection. It was the acknowledgement of a person accepting the weight of a fact. The vehicle moved. Ray's eyes opened once during the ride, not fully, not with the clarity of someone returning to consciousness, but in the partial way of someone surfacing briefly from deep water and then going under again. His gaze moved across the ceiling of the ambulance, and then by some navigation she could not explain landed on her face. He did not speak. She was not sure he could speak. But there was a moment, 3-4 seconds, in which something passed between them that was not recognition exactly, but was adjacent to it. The acknowledgement, perhaps, of two people finding each other in a place neither of them had expected to be. She held his hand for the rest of the ride. She told herself it was a practical gesture. The hand is warm, the touch is orienting. These are things nurses know. She did not examine this reasoning closely. Diana had arranged everything by the time they arrived at North Broad Medical. The facility was private and very good, the kind of place where the waiting room had actual art on the walls rather than prints of seascapes, where the staff moved with the unhurried precision that comes from adequate resources and reasonable patient loads. A team was at the entrance. They took Ray through the double doors with the smooth choreography of people who have done this thousands of times, and a nurse gently positioned herself between Catherine and the doors with the practiced diplomacy of someone who understood that the woman in front of her was accustomed to going where she chose and was asking her politely but firmly not to. "We'll take care of him, Miss Harlow. There's a waiting room on the left." Gracie stood beside Catherine, watching the double doors close. After a moment, she looked up and asked in a voice she was working hard to keep level, "Is he going to be okay?" Catherine crouched to be at eye level with her. This was not a gesture she made often. She was more comfortable standing above a situation than meeting it at its own height. But Gracie deserved a straight answer delivered at a height that didn't require her to crane her neck upward. "The doctors are very good here. Your dad is strong." She paused, and the next part was not calculation but something else, something less managed. "He kept me alive when no one else tried. I think he's harder to stop than people expect." Gracie considered this with her mother's tilted head gravity. Then she nodded once and went to sit in the waiting room with her bear. The next 2 hours were not comfortable hours. Catherine was not built for waiting. Not temperamentally, not professionally, not in any of the ways that might have made the experience manageable. She had built a life structured specifically around the elimination of waiting around, having enough control over outcomes that the spaces between action and result were brief and navigable. This waiting room, with its warm lighting and its quiet jazz and its complete indifference to her preferences, was the inverse of everything she had constructed. She sat. She stood. She walked to the window and back. She sat again. Diana called. The report was efficient and unwelcome. Warren Slate had held an all-staff meeting that morning in Catherine's absence. He had framed it as a routine operational update, which it was not. He had suggested in the language of careful men who understand how to imply, without stating that the company's leadership continuity required attention in light of the CEO's health situation. He had mentioned twice the board's responsibility to protect shareholder interests. The people who had been in that meeting had not pushed back in any organized way because Warren was good at his job, and his job, it turned out, had a secondary dimension that Catherine had underestimated. She held the phone against her ear and listened to Diana lay out the contours of this, and felt something she had not felt in 6 years, the specific sensation of the ground shifting under a structure she had believed was fixed. She had built Harlow Capital on decisions and information, and the discipline never to confuse the two. She had operated on the assumption that the people immediately around her were, whatever their limitations, fundamentally oriented toward the same outcomes she was. This assumption had been wrong about at least one of them, and the wrongness had been in process for long enough that it had developed infrastructure. "He moved while I was in the hospital," she said. Diana's pause was a confirmation. "How many board members?" "2 confirmed in communication with him, possibly a third." She looked at the double doors across the waiting room. Behind them, a man who had broken his own back trying to keep her alive was being rehydrated and stabilized, while the CFO she'd trusted for 14 years was conducting the political equivalent of a land grab. The geometry of this was not complicated. It was in fact brutally simple, and the simplicity of it carried its own particular insult. "Get me everything," she said. "Every internal communication Warren has sent in the last 6 months. Every external contact he made in the 48 hours surrounding the boardroom incident. I want a complete picture before I walk back into that building." She paused. "And Diana, find out who posted that footage clip. The anonymous account. I want a name." She hung up and sat down and did something she almost never did in any space where another person might observe her. She sat with her hands still in her lap and let the situation be what it was without immediately moving to resolve it. The file arrived 3 hours later, assembled with the systematic thoroughness that made Diana indispensable. Catherine read it in the waiting room while Gracie slept on a chair beside her, covered with a hospital blanket that a nurse had brought without being asked. Ray James Calloway, 38 years old. The nursing program she had not known about. The lawsuit he had filed and lost because the other side had retained a partner at a firm she had used for 3 different acquisitions. The law is not blind, it simply bills by the hour. The grocery voucher that had preceded the CPR certification. The 6 days without electricity in October, covered by a neighbor living on Social Security. The eviction notice that had been filed and then delayed, currently pending the landlord, apparently willing to wait another 30 days before forcing the issue. She read it with the discipline of a person who processes information for a living, which meant she did not permit herself to feel it while she was reading it. She finished. She set the phone face down on the seat beside her. And then, in the manner of a person who has finally stopped moving fast enough to outrun something, she felt it. She had built something. The building on Market Street, the portfolio, the reputation, the thing that bore her name, and reflected it back at her from 3 magazine covers mounted near the elevator bank. She had built it with intelligence and discipline, and the particular ruthlessness that is required when you are a woman constructing something large in a context that would prefer you did not. She did not apologize for any of that. But the building had floors below the executive level, and on those floors there were people who arrived before dawn and stayed after dark, who covered the invisible infrastructure of the operation she ran, who earned less in a year than she spent on one client dinner, and she had organized her life with great efficiency around never needing to think about them specifically. They were budget line items. They were managed by other people. They existed in the operational background, the way the HVAC system existed. Essential, unexamined, entirely taken for granted until something broke. Ray Calloway had not broken. He had been broken systematically, and by people operating under her authority for the act of not looking away. A nurse appeared at the door of the waiting room at 11:40 p.m. "Miss Harlow, he's asking for his daughter." Gracie was awake immediately. Children have that gift, the ability to surface from sleep without the gradual ascent that adults require. She stood up with her bear under her arm and looked at Catherine, and then at the nurse, and the look on her face was the particular open and effortful bravery of someone who is scared and has decided not to let the fear make the decisions. Catherine took her hand. She could not have explained why, except that it seemed like the right thing, and she had spent too long doing things for reasons other than that. The room was private at the end of a quiet hallway, and it smelled of antiseptic and the faint sweetness of the saline running through Ray's IV line. He was propped on pillows, the oxygen tube gone now, color returning in the incremental way of someone whose body has begun reclaiming its own territory. He was not the man she had watched in the security footage, not in the sense of appearance, which was what sleep and fluids and the absence of a fever resolve, but in the more essential sense. The man in the footage had been operating on compressed emergency. This man was still. The stillness was not defeat. It was closer to the stillness of a surface that has stopped being agitated and is beginning very slowly to reflect again. He looked at Gracie first. She went to the edge of the bed and placed her bare on his chest with a careful deliberateness, as though installing something important. "I made you soup," she told him, "but you didn't eat it." He reached up and covered her hand with his. He did not say anything, but his face did something that no diagnostic equipment could have measured, and that Catherine, watching from the doorway, recognized without being able to name. She entered. She sat in the chair beside the bed. Gracie settled cross-legged at the foot of the mattress and began going through a small notebook she'd produced from somewhere with the self-sufficient adaptability of children who have learned to make their own entertainment in the spaces where adults need to talk. Ray looked at Catherine. His voice had the texture of something that had been rough-handled. "Why are you here?" "Because I watched the footage." She met his eyes and held them. "All of it. From the beginning. I saw what you did, and I saw what they did to you for doing it." The silence that followed had weight to it, not the absence of sound, but the presence of something that needed space. "They said I assaulted you." "I know what they said." The paper, the termination letter, said inappropriate physical contact with senior personnel. He said the phrase in the flat, careful way of someone who has been repeating it internally for days, testing it against the facts, finding it wrong each time. "I've been trying to figure out how to explain that to a 7-year-old. Catherine kept her voice level, though the effort required was greater than it would have appeared from the outside. "You don't have to explain it to her. And you don't have to explain it to anyone else, because I am going to make what happened unambiguous." She reached into the inner pocket of her jacket and removed the envelope she had prepared that afternoon before coming to Kensington before the ambulance in the 40 minutes between when Diana gave her Ray's address and when the car had come around. It was a formal statement notarized under her signature and the company's letterhead, a complete specific account of what the security footage showed with the medical documentation from the paramedic team attached, and a legal declaration that Ray Calloway's actions constituted emergency medical intervention that had preserved the life of Catherine Harlow, and that no disciplinary action of any kind was warranted or appropriate. He took it from her. He read it slowly. She could see his eyes moving across each line with the thoroughness of someone who has learned not to accept the surface of a document without examining what's underneath. When he finished, his hands were not entirely steady, and he set it on the blanket over his knees and looked at the far wall. "This should never have needed to exist," he said. "No," she agreed. "It shouldn't. Do you want me to thank you for it?" "I want you to keep it. Beyond that, no." He turned to look at her again. There was something in the directness of it, the undeflected quality of his attention, that she was not accustomed to. People looked at Catherine Harlow in many ways with deference, with calculation, with the careful neutrality of those who want something from her and know better than to show it. They did not generally look at her the way Ray was looking at her now, which was with the specific clarity of someone who has nothing left to perform and is simply seeing what is in front of him. "You built that company," he said. "You put your name on the building, and you didn't know mine." She absorbed this. She did not attempt to explain or mitigate it. "No," she said, "I didn't. You built something, and the people who kept it clean were invisible to you. Not invisible like forgotten. Invisible like—" He paused, and when he continued, his voice had the careful quality of someone choosing words that have not been said aloud before. Like the decision to not see us was made a long time ago and nobody revisited it. The room was very quiet. Gracie had stopped writing in her notebook. "That's accurate," Catherine said. He looked at the envelope on the blanket. "This is a starting point, not a resolution." "I know. Then what comes after the starting point?" She had prepared for this, not scripted it, because she had learned that scripted conversations were only reliable when the other person was reading from the same script, but considered it carefully during the drive over. She had an offer ready. She did not deliver it then. Instead, she sat with his question for a full breath because it deserved that and because she had become too accustomed to answering before she had fully heard. "I want to offer you a position," she said. "Not a maintenance position. A new role, the first director of an employee welfare program I'm going to build at Harlow Capital. I want you to design what it looks like, from the beginning, no existing template." The silence that followed was different from the previous silences. It had the quality of a room where furniture is being rearranged. "You want to give me a job?" "I want to give you a seat at the table you've been cleaning under." He looked at Gracie. She had set down the notebook entirely now and was watching her father with the specific attentiveness of a child triangulating between two adults to determine the temperature of a situation. He looked back at Catherine. "I don't want to work for you." He said it without hostility. It had the directness of a statement that is true and knows itself to be true and is not asking for a reaction. Catherine waited. "Everything you're doing right now, the hospital, the envelope, this conversation, it feels like you're settling an account, like there's a ledger somewhere and you're trying to get it to zero." He shifted against the pillows carefully, the way people move when they are still being managed by pain they are not going to mention. "I'm not interested in being someone's debt clearance." She held the response that came first, the one that was defensive and efficient and would have won the argument while losing the conversation, and let it pass. "You're partly right," she said. "There is a ledger. I'm not going to pretend otherwise because you'd see through it and we'd be done talking." She leaned forward slightly in the chair. "But you're wrong that it's the whole of it. I didn't build what I built by making decisions that were only about making myself feel better. This is also—" She stopped, reoriented. "I have been running a company on the assumption that the people at the top of the structure are the load-bearing walls. The security footage showed me a man who learned CPR to get a grocery voucher and used it to keep me alive while 8 executives stood against the walls of the room and did nothing. I was wrong about where the load was being carried. That's not sentiment. That's a structural error I need to correct." Ray was quiet for a long time. Gracie had picked up the notebook again but was not writing in it. "I'll think about it," he said finally. "That's enough." She stood. She was almost to the door when his voice came again, quieter, and with a different quality, less guarded, closer to the surface of whatever he was actually feeling. "Why didn't anyone come? In the room. 9 people, and not one of them moved." She turned back. It was a question she had asked herself in various forms since the moment she'd pressed play on the security footage. She had no answer that felt adequate, but she had one that she believed was honest. Because they were calculating. All of them. What it would cost, what it would look like, whether it was their responsibility. You didn't calculate. Something moved across his face. Not pleasure, something more complex and less comfortable. "I thought about Gracie," he said. "That's all. I thought if it were her, I'd want someone not to walk away." She held that. Then she said quietly as she turned toward the door, "That's not a small thing. People spend their whole careers trying to build organizations that produce exactly that instinct, and most of them never manage it." She went out. In the hallway, she stood for a moment against the cool wall and let the fluorescent quiet of the corridor be what it was. Diana had texted during the conversation, 3 messages accumulating. She did not look at them yet. She looked at the door she had just come through, at the thin line of warm light visible beneath it, and she thought about the way the man inside had looked at her without adjusting his eyes for who she was, and she understood that this was going to be more complicated than an envelope and a job offer. It was also, she thought, the first genuinely uncomplicated thing she had wanted in 6 years. Over the next 2 days, the hospital became, in a functional sense, a kind of anteroom between Ray's old life and whatever came next. The fever broke on the second night. By the following morning, he could sit up without the room reorganizing itself, and by afternoon he was eating real food. Not IV calories, and the nurses had a better sense of what they were dealing with, which was a body that had been running on insufficient inputs for an extended period and was now given adequate resources, demonstrating a determined competence at recovery. Gracie was there most of the day. A social worker from the hospital had connected with Diana to handle the logistics, and Edna had been brought over that morning. Diana had arranged a car, had arranged a thorough medical examination that Edna had agreed to, with the resigned practicality of someone who had been a nurse long enough to understand that resistance to free health care was a luxury of the healthy, and the room had by Tuesday afternoon taken on the provisional warmth of a space that several people had decided to occupy together without any of them fully articulating the arrangement. Catherine came in the late mornings when the ward was quietest and left before the afternoon visiting hours complicated the corridors. She did not come to press the job offer. She had meant what she'd said about giving him time, and she understood that a person who needed time was not a person who needed to be visited at fixed intervals with implicit expectations. She came because there were things that needed deciding about the welfare program that she found herself wanting to think through with someone who would not calculate his answers. On the third morning, she brought a legal pad and sat in the chair beside his bed, and they talked about it the way people talk about problems that have not yet hardened into proposals, provisionally, interrogatively, with the productive friction of two people who have very different vantage points on the same building. He asked, who would run it? She said she intended for him to run it. He asked what recourse an employee would have if the department itself was compromised. She said that was a good question. He said it wasn't a question, it was a design requirement. She wrote it down. You need windows, he said at one point with a specificity that seemed to come from somewhere concrete. Windows. In every working room, natural light. The break room on the 22nd floor has one window. It faces an air shaft. He said it without accusation, which somehow made it land harder than accusation would have. People are down there 8 hours. Light matters. She wrote natural light all workspaces. She underlined it. And the emergency fund can't require manager approval, he continued. If someone needs $500 to keep their electricity on, they can't go to the person who decides their performance review and say they're struggling. You've built in a conflict of interest. Then who approves it? An independent HR contact, someone who doesn't report up through the same chain. He paused. And the threshold should be higher than 500. Rent in this city isn't what it was. Diana called at 11:40 with news that Catherine took in the hallway. The anonymous account that had posted the initial footage clip had been traced by the firm's digital forensics contact to a shell profile created 11 months earlier. Created, the contact believed with high confidence at the request of Warren Slate, who had used the same third-party PR operative twice before for what the operative's own records described as reputation management operations. The operative had been paid in 2 installments, the second of which had gone out 48 hours after the boardroom incident. Catherine stood in the hospital hallway, holding this information with both hands, so to speak, feeling its weight and its implications. She went back into the room. Ray was looking at the window, the actual window which faced a courtyard with a bare-limbed tree that was doing nothing in particular except being a tree in November. She sat down. Warren Slate arranged the footage leak, she said. He turned from the window. He did not look surprised. He looked instead like someone who has been waiting for a confirmation they didn't need in order to know the thing was true. The account that posted it. A shell profile, 11 months old, paid through an operative he's used before. 11 months. He repeated this with the quiet focus of a person doing arithmetic. He set that up before the incident. Yes. So it wasn't a reaction to what happened. No, it was, she chose the word carefully, infrastructure. He was quiet for a moment. Then, he built the mechanism first and waited for something to put through it. That's what the evidence suggests. He looked at the window again. The tree was still being a tree. What are you going to do? What I should have done when I first watched the footage. She said it without drama because drama would have been a performance and she was tired of performances. Remove him completely. and make sure the record is corrected in every place it was corrupted. That won't undo what happened to me. No. She let the no be complete without qualification. It won't, but you know what will partially address it. He looked back at her. Someone with your specific knowledge of what that building feels like from the outside of the glass, being the person who decides what happens inside it from now on. He was quiet for a long time. Gracie had fallen asleep at the foot of the bed, curled on her side, with her bear tucked under her chin, with the preternatural ease of children who sleep wherever the need finds them. The monitor beeped its steady rhythm. The tree in the courtyard moved slightly in a wind that existed on the other side of the glass. "I'm not going to be useful to anyone if I walk in there as someone you rescued," he said finally. "I need to walk in as someone who chose. That's the only way I want you to walk in." He looked at Gracie. He looked at Catherine. He was measuring something that could not be measured in any conventional sense, the distance between what he had been and what he was being asked to consider becoming, and whether the ground between those 2 points was crossable by someone who had just spent a week unable to stand up. "I want to see it first," he said. "The space, before I decide." She reached into her jacket pocket and took out her phone. She opened a photo and turned it toward him. A wide empty floor, east-facing windows running the full length of the far wall, afternoon light coming in at a low angle and spreading across bare floorboards. The room contained nothing except possibility, which is the most demanding thing a room can contain. He looked at it for a long time. "Send me that," he said. She did. He looked at it on his own phone, then at the image in his own hands, which made it different in some way that mattered, and then set the phone on the blanket and looked at the ceiling. "One step," he said. "I'll go see it. One step at a time." She nodded. She stood. She was at the door when he said her name. Not Miss Harlow. Her name Catherine. And she turned. "You built something that I kept clean for 3 months without you knowing who I was." He said it without heat, which made it the truest version of itself. "That's not a small thing to get right." She held his gaze. "No," she said. "It isn't." She went out. The elevator down was empty. She rode it to the lobby and walked through the automatic doors into the November air, which was cold in the straightforward, non-negotiable way of the Northeast in late fall, and she stood on the sidewalk for a moment with her hands at her sides and thought about a man who had decided before he ever needed the decision that he was not going to be one of the people who stood still. She called Marcus to bring the car around. While she waited, she called Diana and began the process, methodical, thorough, with the unhurried precision of someone who has been building cases for 30 years of dismantling everything Warren Slate had constructed in the shadows of the company she had built in the light. The new apartment was in North Philadelphia on a tree-lined block that had not yet completed its arc from neglected to restored, which meant the rents were reasonable and the neighbors were real. Diana had handled the logistics with her usual invisible efficiency. 3 bedrooms, adequate kitchen, a small balcony off the living room, and a building supernamed Gerald, who was as far as anyone could determine exactly as straightforward as he appeared to be. Ray walked in on a Thursday afternoon 2 days after discharge. He still moved carefully, not dramatically, but with the measured deliberateness of someone paying attention to how his body is reporting, and he stopped inside the front door and stood in the middle of the living room for a moment that was longer than strictly necessary for taking in the dimensions of a space. Gracie had no such pause. She was through the hallway and into the kitchen in approximately 4 seconds, opening cabinets with the systematic efficiency of someone conducting an inventory. Her voice came back to them from around the corner. "There's cereal, and there's the kind of crackers we like, and—" A pause. "Dad, there's colored pencils in here." Edna came in behind them slower, with the walker she was still using on bad hip days. She stood in the entrance and looked at the room and said with the precise intonation of someone who has lived long enough to know the difference between things and the conditions that make things possible, "I haven't had a working gas range since Clinton's 2nd term." Ray laughed. It was the sound of something that had been stored under pressure, releasing genuine, slightly rougher than he probably intended, and over almost before it started. But it was there. On the kitchen counter there was a small glass vase with white daisies, the kind that come from the grocery store, and have no pretension about being anything other than what they are, and a card tucked beneath it in handwriting that was exact and slightly angular, the handwriting of someone who has learned to make their letters functional first and expressive second. You deserve peace. C.H. Ray took the card. He read it twice. He folded it along its crease and held it in his hand for a moment, not with sentiment exactly, but with the careful attention of someone who is deciding what category a thing belongs in. Then he put it in his shirt pocket close and went to find out which cabinet held the coffee. That night, after Gracie was asleep in the room, she had chosen the one with the window that faced the tree on the street because she liked trees, something she had inherited from Linda, who had always insisted on planting something wherever they lived, and after Edna had turned in with the satisfied practicality of someone who has negotiated with a difficult day and won. Ray sat on the small balcony in his jacket and looked at the city. He opened his phone. The photo of the empty office floor was still there. He looked at it for a while in the way that people look at things they are trying to decide whether to believe in. The windows, the light, the bare floors waiting for the first weight of occupancy. He thought about the things he had said to Catherine in the hospital room about not wanting to be someone's conscience-clearing project, and he thought about whether what she had offered was that or whether it was something else, something more demanding and more honest than absolution, which was the opportunity to actually change a thing that was wrong rather than simply be compensated for being harmed by it. He thought about Dave Ostrowski in the community center, explaining that the antidote to paralysis was a decision made in advance. He thought about Gracie's colored pencils in the kitchen cabinet placed there by someone who had paid enough attention to know that a 7-year-old needed something that was specifically hers in a space that was not yet familiar. He typed, "I want to come see it before I decide." He sent it before he could construct reasons not to. The response came in 4 minutes, which told him she was still awake, still working, still moving at the velocity of someone who has identified a problem and is not going to allow it to persist. 8th floor. River facing. Tomorrow at 10 if you're ready. No pressure if you're not. He looked at the last sentence for a moment. It was the most carefully chosen thing she had said to him since the hospital. 3 words that offered him something most people in her position would not have thought to offer, which was the right to not be ready. He understood from the specificity of that offering that she had thought about what he needed and had given it without being asked. He typed, "I'll be there at 10. He put the phone in his pocket and looked at Philadelphia spread below and around him. Not the version of it he'd been looking at from bus windows for years, the city of routes and transfers and the particular exhaustion of going from one insufficient thing to the next, but a different version, or perhaps the same one seen from a position that had changed. The lights were the same lights. The sounds were the same sounds. But something in the angle was different, and the difference was not comfortable exactly, not settled but alive in a way that the months before it had not been. He stayed on the balcony until the cold became definitive. Then he went inside, checked the lock on the front door, looked in on Gracie, one bear, one breathing child, one window with a tree, and turned off the light in the hallway and stood in the dark apartment listening to the sound of people he loved being safely asleep, which is a sound that people who have come close to losing it tend to hear differently than those who have not. The elevator opened onto the 8th floor at 10:03 on a Thursday morning, and Ray stepped out into a room full of nothing except light. It was the light that stopped him first. He had expected an office space cubicle ghosts, the architectural residue of previous occupancy, the particular institutional blankness of a room between functions. Instead, the floor was empty, in the way that certain things are empty, deliberately, expectantly, with the quality of a page that has been kept clean on purpose. The east-facing windows ran the full length of the far wall floor to ceiling, and the November sun came through them at the low angle of late fall, spreading across bare hardwood in long planes that warmed the wood to a color between amber and gold. The river was visible in the distance, a silver thread stitched through the city's fabric, catching light at intervals. Ray had worked in this building for 3 months and had not known this floor existed. Catherine was at the windows with her back to him, holding a coffee cup she had not been drinking from, which he noticed because people who are actually drinking coffee drink it, and people who are holding it for something to do with their hands hold it differently. She turned when she heard him. "You came," she said. "I said I would." He walked slowly around the perimeter of the space. He did this the way he had learned to assess a room over years of maintaining them, not dramatically, not with the performed thoughtfulness of a person who wants to be seen considering something, but quietly, functionally, his eyes reading the structural details that most visitors don't notice: the weight-bearing columns, the HVAC placement, the distance from the windows to where a workstation would naturally want to be, the light at different points in the room and what it would do to a person sitting in each of them over the course of a day. He stopped at the far corner northeast where the window met the adjacent wall. The angle here gave a view of both the river and the street grid below two different kinds of order, one natural and one imposed, both necessary. He stood there for a moment. "No glass walls," he said. "For any of the rooms we divide this into, I don't want people seeing into meeting spaces from the corridor." Catherine had followed him at a distance, giving him room to think, without the pressure of proximity. "Why?" "Because the conversations that need to happen in a welfare office are the ones people are most afraid to have in front of witnesses." He moved from the corner toward the center of the floor. "If someone comes in to report a problem with their supervisor and they can see their coworkers walking past the glass while they're talking, they'll edit themselves. They'll say the manageable version instead of the true version. You'll get data that feels complete and isn't." She was writing. Not on her phone. She had a legal pad under her arm, a pen in her hand, and she was writing in the compact, legible script of someone who has been taking notes in meetings for 20 years. He had not expected that. He had expected a tablet, a voice recorder, the technology of documentation. The legal pad was something else. It was the instrument of a person who wanted to think, not just record. "The emergency fund," he said. "Tell me what you want it to look like. Available within 24 hours of application. No committee review for amounts under $2,000. A single welfare coordinator makes the call, someone who doesn't share a reporting chain with the applicant's management, and the fund should be large enough that using it doesn't feel like using the last of something." What does large enough mean in numbers? $500,000 in liquid reserve, replenished quarterly. If you're burning through it, that's information about what's wrong with the rest of the system, so you fix the system, not the fund. Catherine wrote. He watched her write and felt the strangeness of the situation in a way he had not allowed himself to feel in the hospital, where the strangeness had been submerged under the more immediate demands of being sick. He was standing in a building whose floors he had cleaned and being asked to design something that would change how the people who cleaned them were treated. The gap between those two positions was not bridgeable by a job offer or a formal statement or any single gesture. It was the kind of gap that got crossed, if it got crossed at all, by accumulated choices made over a long period of time, by people who understood what they were choosing. He was not certain yet whether he and Catherine Harlow were those people. He was certain that the conversation they were having was the right kind of starting point. "Transportation," he said, "for night shift workers. For anyone finishing after 11 p.m. or starting before 5 a.m. Car service or reimbursed rideshare, no cap on frequency, no approval required. The areas where we pull our overnight staff are not areas where a woman should be waiting at a bus stop at midnight." Catherine looked up from the pad. There was something in her expression, not surprise because she was too experienced to show surprise as an unfiltered response, but a quality of attention that was different from professional interest. It was the expression of someone receiving information that is reshaping a map they thought they had already drawn accurately. They worked for an hour and 40 minutes. He pulled the legal pad to himself at one point and sketched a rough floor plan: welfare coordinator's office here, the shared waiting area there, a smaller private room for conversations that needed absolute containment. The windows stayed unobstructed in every working space. The waiting area had a view of the river because he had spent enough time in institutional waiting rooms to know that a window with a view is the difference between endurance and dehumanization. When the sketch was done, he pushed it back across the floor. They had ended up sitting cross-legged on the hardwood, the legal pad between them, which was not the meeting posture of two executives, but was the posture of two people actually thinking, and Catherine looked at it for a long time. "This is good," she said. "It's a start." "Are you saying yes?" He considered the question the way he considered things that mattered, without rushing it, without performing deliberation, just actually sitting with it long enough to hear what the honest answer was. He thought about what Edna had said 2 nights ago when he'd described the offer over the dinner she'd cooked on the gas range. She was still getting acquainted with. You survived a boardroom full of people who wouldn't move, and you're afraid of an office. He thought about Gracie's colored pencils in the kitchen cabinet, and about the bowl of cold noodle soup on the floor of the old apartment, and about a community center in West Philly where a former paramedic had told him that the antidote to paralysis was a decision made in advance. "I'm saying yes," he said, "not because of what you did for us, because of what you said about the structural error." He paused. "If this were charity, I'd have said no. But you're describing a problem that needs someone who understands it from the inside, and I understand it from the inside. That's a different thing." She looked at him with that quality of attention he was beginning to recognize, the unfiltered version, the one that preceded the practiced surface. "Yes," she said. "It is." He stood. He offered his hand. She took it, a handshake, deliberate, the gesture of two people entering into something that they both intend to take seriously, and the formality of it was not awkward but clarifying the way a well-made joint clarifies the structure it belongs to. He was at the elevator when she called after him, "Ray?" He turned. She was standing in the center of the empty floor with the legal pad against her chest, and the light behind her doing what the light in that room did, which was to make everything in it look slightly more consequential than it had looked a moment before. "Thank you for coming." "You gave me a reason to," he said. The elevator door opened. He got in. The announcement went out through the company's internal system that afternoon: Ray Calloway, Director of Employee Welfare, Harlow Capital Group. New department, new function, new standard. Diana had written the language with Catherine's input, and the final version was precise without being cold and specific without being defensive, the written equivalent of a firm handshake. Within 90 minutes, Warren Slate had read it. Ray learned this not from anyone at the company but from Diana, who called him at 4:40 p.m. at Catherine's request to give him information he would need before the morning. Warren had been notified of his termination that afternoon in a meeting that lasted 11 minutes and produced no public response from him, which was, Diana implied, without stating directly, the response of someone who had been given enough of the evidence to understand that a public response would make things substantially worse. His badge had been deactivated. His access to internal systems had been revoked. He had left the building through the main entrance at 3:52 p.m. carrying a box that he had packed himself, because Warren Slate was the kind of man who would not allow someone else to pack his box. "There's one more thing," Diana said, and her tone shifted in the way that tone shifts when the thing being introduced is the most important thing. "The digital forensics report is complete. The anonymous account that posted the footage clip, we have the full transaction record now." He paid the operative in August, 4 months before the incident. Ray was at the kitchen table in the new apartment. Gracie was in her room doing homework. Edna was watching the evening news in the living room volume low enough to be companionable rather than intrusive. He held the phone against his ear and let the information settle. "He built it before he had anything to put through it," Ray said. "Yes." "That means he was looking for a reason, any reason." "That's the interpretation the legal team is working with, yes." He sat with this. The difference between what he had suspected and what had now been confirmed was not a difference in the facts he had known on some level since the boardroom, since the words 8 witnesses and permission delivered with the ease of something rehearsed, but there was a difference in what confirmed knowledge did to the understanding. Warren Slate had not reacted to Ray. He had been prepared for someone like Ray. He had maintained the infrastructure of an accusation for 4 months, waiting for the moment when a maintenance worker or a security guard or any of the dozens of invisible people moving through that building might do something that could be fed into the machine. Ray had simply been the one who gave him something to feed. "What does Catherine want to do with it?" he asked. "She said to ask you." He was quiet for a moment. "Tell her to publish it. All of it. Whatever the legal team says can be released, the timeline, the payments, the account. If it happened in my name, the correction should be public too." "I'll tell her." He set the phone down and looked at the table. He thought about the group chat screenshot from 11 days ago, the words that had been used, the confidence of people who had already decided what they saw. He thought about the manager on 18th Street who had looked at him across a desk and made a practical decision he was not comfortable with. He thought about the teenager outside the convenience store and the laughter that had followed him down the block. None of that was gone. A press release from a corporate legal department was not an antidote to the shape a story takes once it has been given the form people want. But it was a fact in the record. And facts in the record mattered not because they always won, but because without them there was nothing for the truth to stand on. The smear arrived the next morning, which told him that Warren Slate had made his own calls the previous afternoon. Ray had been at the new office for 20 minutes when Diana appeared in the open doorway with her phone in her hand and the expression of someone carrying information they would have preferred not to be carrying. "It's out," she said. "Multiple channels coordinated. The eviction notice, the civil suit, records, the juvenile file. Someone had the seal broken. Or claimed to." He looked at her. "Is the juvenile record actually public?" "No. What's circulating is a description of it, not the actual document. Someone was given a summary, and they've been describing it as confirmed." "How many outlets?" 3 blogs, 1 local news aggregator, and a social account with significant following. She paused. "The framing is executive with criminal background appointed by CEO. There's a quote from an anonymous source within the company questioning Catherine's judgment." He stood up from the desk. He had been unpacking the few things he'd brought, arranging them on the surface of a workspace that was still more potential than reality, and walked to the window. The river was where it had been the day before, silver and indifferent and present. He looked at it for a moment. He thought about Edna's voice 2 nights ago in the kitchen of the new apartment, when he'd told her about Warren Slate and the infrastructure and the 4 months of preparation. You want to know what the difference is between a man who stays down and a man who doesn't. The man who doesn't understands that the floor is not his permanent address. "Tell Catherine I need the conference room on this floor," he said. "Full staff. Everyone who works in this building every shift. I want them there in 30 minutes. Diana looked at him. "You want to address it directly?" "I want to address them directly. Those are different things." The room filled in 25 minutes. Ray watched them come in, the maintenance crew, the cafeteria staff, the security team from both day and overnight shifts, the administrative assistants, the building services coordinator, who had been at Harlow Capital for 19 years and who walked in with the wariness of someone who has attended enough all-staff meetings to distrust the category. There were executive assistants and file clerks and 3 people from the parking structure who had been called in specially and who looked uncertain about why they were there. Catherine came in last and stood near the back of the room. She had not been invited explicitly. She had come anyway, which he understood as a statement about what kind of person she intended to be in this particular moment. He stood at the front of the room without notes. He had written nothing because the things he was going to say did not need to be written. They were things he had been carrying for long enough that they had become part of his internal architecture, and he had only to speak accurately about what was already there. "Most of you saw something this morning," he said, "or you heard about it. There are things being said about my past, and I'm going to address them directly because the people in this room deserve directness more than they deserve managed information." The room was completely still. "When I was 17 years old, I was arrested for shoplifting. The item was a box of cough medicine. My mother had pneumonia and we had $11. The medicine cost $8. I took the box and I was caught and I was charged, and the record was sealed when I turned 18 because I was a juvenile with no prior record." He paused, not for effect, but because the next part required him to be accurate. "I am not ashamed of that. I was a kid who didn't want his mother to suffer because of a number on a receipt. I would do it again. What I would not do again is believe that it was the kind of thing that could be used against me, because I had stopped believing that I was the kind of person anyone was paying attention to." He moved along the front of the room, not pacing, just moving, making the connection between himself and the people in front of him spatial rather than only verbal. "There's also a civil lawsuit in my record from 4 years ago. I sued the insurance company of the man who killed my wife in a drunk driving accident. I lost. Not because I was wrong, because they had better lawyers." He stopped. "And there's an eviction notice from 11 days ago which was filed because I had not paid rent in 6 weeks, which was because I had not had income in 6 weeks, which was because I was fired from this building for performing CPR on a person who would not have survived without it. Nobody moved. The building services coordinator, who had been at Harlow Capital for 19 years, had her arms crossed over her chest and her eyes were wet, and she was not doing anything about it. I'm telling you all of this, not because I need you to feel sorry for me. I don't. His voice had the particular quality of something said without any performance around it, just the sound of a person speaking accurately about what they know. I'm telling you because this office, this department, this room is supposed to be for people whose stories look like mine. People who've been behind on rent, people who've had records, people who've had bad years or bad luck or bad timing and who went to work anyway and did their jobs and never expected anyone to notice. I'm not going to run this department from behind a glass wall pretending I came from somewhere else. I came from the floor. That's the most useful credential I have. He stopped in the center of the room and looked at them at the specific faces one at a time because he had spent years being looked through and he understood the difference between a face that sees you and a face that is looking in your direction. You don't have to trust this yet. Trust is built with time and with actions, not with speeches. But I want you to know that the person running this office has needed everything it's going to offer. That's not a liability. That's the point. From the back corner near the window, someone began to clap. Not the exploratory see if others join variety of applause, deliberate, certain the sound of a person who has made up their mind. A second person joined, then 3 more, and then the room filled with it, in the way that a room fills when something true has been said aloud in a place where truth has been scarce, which is all at once and without apparent coordination. Catherine at the back did not clap. She stood still with her hands at her sides and looked at the man at the front of the room with an expression that was not one of the expressions she wore in professional contexts. It was older than those expressions and less managed, and it was the look of someone who has been watching a thing happen that they understand in real time is exactly the thing that needed to happen. Across the building, Warren Slate had already left. He had not attended the meeting. He had no badge with which to access the building. But his operative, the same third-party contact whose transaction records were now in Diana's possession, had sent a message that morning asking whether additional measures were required. Warren had not responded. He had read the message twice and set his phone face down on the table of the restaurant where he was eating breakfast alone, and he had thought about the system he had built over 14 years, the quiet filings, the managed exits, the carefully constructed narratives that had kept inconvenient people at a manageable distance from inconvenient truths. He had thought about the fact that system had worked because the people who ran it himself primarily, but the infrastructure around him had always had more access to the mechanisms of truth-telling than the people being managed. That calculus had changed. He had no response to that because 14 years of building systems for other people's vulnerabilities had left him with a diminished capacity to examine his own. He paid his check and left. Ray did not see this. He heard about it later secondhand from Diana, who had heard it from the building's security log. He did not feel what he had expected to feel, which was something like vindication. He felt instead the particular emptiness that follows the end of a threat. Not relief exactly, but the absence of the vigilance that threat had required, which left a quiet where the watching had been. The welfare department opened officially 6 weeks later. The floor had been transformed in that time with a speed that reflected Catherine's decision to allocate resources commensurate with the stated priority rather than the usual institutional pace. Offices with solid doors. A waiting area whose window faced the river furnished with chairs that were actually comfortable. A kitchen alcove with a working coffee maker and food that was not vending machine food. A counseling room with acoustic insulation sufficient that a person could speak at normal volume and not be audible in the corridor. Ray had specified each of these things, and they had each been built as specified, which was an experience so contrary to his previous professional life that he occasionally had to pause and verify that the specifications had actually been followed rather than approximately followed. He hired a welfare coordinator in the 3rd week, a woman named Joan Pruitt, 52, who had spent 18 years as a social worker with the city of Philadelphia before the budget cuts that had restructured the department and reduced her to a part-time consultant role. She had the specific competence that came from having processed 10,000 cases in conditions of inadequate support, and she had an absolute intolerance for bureaucratic friction that manifested as a systematic talent for finding the shortest path between a person in need and the resource they required. Ray interviewed her for 40 minutes and hired her in the 41st. The emergency fund made its first disbursement in week 2. A building maintenance worker named Curtis, who needed $1,400 to avoid eviction, whose manager had been aware of the situation and had not known what to do about it, and who had not asked for help because he had not known help was available. Curtis was in Ray's office for 11 minutes. He left with the disbursement approved, a follow-up appointment with Joan, and an expression that Ray recognized because he had worn it himself at the kitchen table in the old apartment on the night the groceries ran out, the expression of a person who has braced for a no so completely that the yes has become temporarily unprocessable. "How long have you been in the building?" Ray asked him before he left. 7 years, Curtis said. 7 years. Ray thought about 7 years of moving through a building without being known by the people who ran it, and about the 38 pairs of hands that had produced the disbursement approval on the desk in front of him. Joan's review, his signature, the independent fund coordinator's confirmation. All of it built specifically so that Curtis did not have to explain his situation to someone who held his performance review. "It's going to get faster," Ray told him. "We're still finding the friction points, but this is what we're here for." Curtis nodded. He folded the approval form with the careful attention of someone handling something fragile. He said thank you in the specific way of a person who means it without knowing how to make the weight of the meaning audible. Ray understood this and did not require anything more from the thank you than it contained. The first month numbers were what they were: 247 reports submitted, of which 61 required active intervention. 9 supervisors were flagged for review based on patterns in the report data, not terminated on the basis of individual complaints, but examined with the systematic attention that the existing HR structure had never applied to the lower levels of the org chart. 3 of the 9 received formal warnings. 2 were separated from the company following independent review. The remaining 4 demonstrated under structured oversight that the patterns had been addressable and addressed them. 14 employees were reconsidered for positions they had been passed over for in the previous 2 performance cycles. Of those, 9 received promotions that the retroactive review process determined should have occurred earlier. The other 5 were placed on development tracks with concrete benchmarks and timelines. Ray presented these numbers to Catherine in a meeting that lasted 45 minutes, and that he had prepared for with the thoroughness of someone who understands that data without narrative is incomplete, and narrative without data is insufficient. Catherine listened. She asked 7 questions, each of which demonstrated that she had read the full report rather than the executive summary, which he had not expected, and which told him something about the version of herself she was becoming, in parallel with the version of himself he was becoming. "The counseling room," she said near the end of the meeting. "Utilization is low. It's week 4. People don't trust a new thing immediately. They watch it for a while first and see whether the people who use it are punished in some way they haven't anticipated." He paused. "Give it 3 months. If utilization is still low at 3 months, then we have a stigma problem and we address it directly." She made a note. What would addressing it directly look like? It would look like a senior leader using it, visibly, not in a performed way that reads as manufactured and it makes the problem worse, in an actual way for actual reasons. She looked up from the legal pad. The expression that crossed her face was the particular one he had come to recognize as the face she made when something had landed accurately in a place she had not prepared to receive it. She did not respond to this directly. She wrote something on the pad and circled it, and he did not ask what it was. Winter tightened over Philadelphia in the weeks that followed. The river turned the color of pewter under overcast skies. The temperature dropped with the abruptness of the northeast, the overnight shift workers arriving in coats that the transportation reimbursement had made marginally more adequate. Ray worked long hours that were different from the long hours of his previous work. Not the hours of someone extending themselves past their limit under pressure they cannot change, but the hours of someone building something and finding that the building takes more time than anticipated, which is a different relationship to tiredness. He and Catherine developed a working rhythm that was particular to them, brief and efficient in formal settings, longer and less linear when the problem required actual thinking rather than decision confirmation. She came to the 8th floor in the late afternoons sometimes when the building's traffic had thinned and they would work through something on the legal pad, a new process, a structural question, a situation that Joan had escalated that required the combination of her institutional authority and his institutional knowledge. He had learned to identify when her efficiency was genuine and when it was defensive. The two looked the same from the outside but produced different silences, and she had learned, he thought, to recognize something equivalent in him, though she had never said so directly. One evening in December, after the building had gone mostly quiet, she stood at the 8th floor window looking at the river and said without preamble, "Thomas would have liked this." She did not elaborate. She said it the way people say things that have been waiting a long time for an appropriate moment. Not with grief exactly, but with the specific tenderness of someone touching something valuable that has survived something difficult. Ray did not offer condolence. He stood beside her and looked at the river with her for a moment, and the shared looking was its own adequate response. These were small accumulations. They did not constitute a declaration or a resolution of anything. They were the material of which something was being built. Not a structure with defined walls and a final form, but the kind of thing that announces its nature gradually through the repeated fact of its own persistence. The national conference was in Washington in February, at a hotel near the Capitol that had the particular formal grandeur of places where people have been arriving to say important things for so long that the architecture has absorbed a residue of consequence. The conference was titled Labor Justice and Workplace Equity, and it ran for 3 days. Ray was on the main program on the second-day keynote speaker afternoon session, the slot after lunch when audiences are most difficult, and the speakers who hold the room are the ones who have something real to say rather than something polished to say it. He flew down the morning of. Gracie had wanted to come, and Catherine had arranged it, she and Edna both, with the same logistical quiet that characterized all of Catherine's arrangements, so that by the time Ray understood the scope of what had been organized, it was already done. They flew together, the four of them, Ray, Gracie, Edna, and Catherine, who had a separate aisle seat, and worked for the first hour of the flight and then closed her laptop and looked out the window and did not work anymore. The conference hall seated 400. By the time the afternoon session began, it was close to capacity, which meant the room had the specific density of attention that either supports a speaker or exhausts them. Gracie was in the 3rd row in the red dress she had chosen herself at the store on Germantown Avenue, with Edna beside her in the navy coat she'd been saving for an occasion that qualified. Catherine had taken a seat toward the back, not hidden, not anonymous, just outside the center of gravity of the event, where she could observe without organizing. Ray walked to the lectern and looked at the room. He did not have notes. He had known since the day he agreed to speak that the thing he needed to say did not exist in a document. Yet it existed in the accumulated experience of 38 years, and specifically in the 8 days between the boardroom and the ambulance, and specifically in the 7 minutes on the floor of the boardroom when a man in a charcoal suit had been constructing a sentence while Ray was trying to keep a person alive. He had lived inside the story long enough to understand its shape, and he trusted that the shape would hold. "I learned CPR in exchange for a grocery voucher," he said. The room's ambient sound, the rustling, the chair adjusting the late arrivals, negotiating their way to seats, diminished all at once the way sound diminishes in a room when something has been said that requires attention. That's the honest beginning of this. Not a calling, not a credential. A voucher that was worth about $20 at a grocery store in West Philadelphia. And 18 months later, I used what I learned in that room to keep someone alive. He paused. And then I lost my job for it. He told the story the way he had told it to the staff in the Harlow conference room, without performance, without the managed emotional beats of a prepared presentation. He told it with the specific detail of a person who was there and who has not romanticized the experience into something more comfortable than it was. The 11 seconds, the compressions, the pain across his back and the voice above him constructing an accusation out of the architecture of his help, the termination letter and its cold, precise language, the bus rides and the shut doors. Gracie's noodle soup cooling on the floor beside the pull-out. The room was very quiet. "I am not a perfect person," he said. "I have a sealed juvenile record. I have debt. I lost a lawsuit I should have won. I have spent years doing work that made the world function without being invited to participate in the decisions that governed that world." He moved from behind the lectern not for drama, but because standing behind a podium was a posture that belonged to someone delivering information, and he was doing something different. The people who build buildings and keep them clean and cook the food and drive the cars and watch the children, those people are not background. They are not the human equivalent of infrastructure. They are the reason anything else is possible, and they have been managed and overlooked and occasionally punished for demanding the basic dignities that are supposed to be the floor of this country's relationship with people who work in it. He stopped in the center of the stage. The room held its stillness with the particular quality of attention that cannot be manufactured, the quality that emerges when a roomful of people have recognized something in what they're hearing. You don't have to be unbroken to fight for something true. You just have to refuse to let the breaking be the last word. Gracie made it to the stage approximately 4 seconds after the applause began. She came through the space between the third row and the stage edge with the directness of a child who has decided that logistics are someone else's problem, and she wrapped both arms around her father's waist and pressed her face into his jacket. He bent down and held her the way a person holds something they have been terrified of losing completely without the management of expression that adults apply to public moments. His eyes were closed. The applause continued around them, and he did not hear it in any way that mattered, because the only thing present to him was his daughter's weight and warmth and the specific sound of her breathing against his chest. "You did it, Dad," she said, muffled by his jacket. He pressed his mouth against the top of her head. "We did it, Gracie. This one's for all of us." At the back of the room, Catherine was standing, not applauding in the synchronized way of the crowd, but standing still with her hands at her sides, looking at the man and the child on the stage. The expression on her face was not one she had prepared. It was the expression of someone witnessing something that has bypassed every professional defense and arrived directly at the person underneath who has been there the whole time, less armored than she had thought, more available to being moved than the years had suggested. She did not wipe her eyes. She simply let what was there be there, which was for Catherine Harlow its own form of courage. They flew back that evening. Gracie fell asleep on the plane with her head against Ray's arm, the red dress traded for a sweatshirt she'd pulled from her bag, her feet tucked under her the way children arrange themselves with the complete confidence that the adult beside them will manage the inconvenience. Edna was across the aisle, eyes closed, compression socks visible below the hem of her slacks. Catherine was in the window seat 2 rows up, working on something. Though when Ray glanced forward at one point she was not working, she was looking at the dark glass of the window which reflected the cabin interior in miniature, a small illuminated world suspended over the darkness of the ground below. He did not speak to her on the plane. There would be time for speaking. There was, for the first time in longer than he could accurately account for, the sense that time was something he was moving toward, rather than something that was being consumed. He wrote the letter 3 nights later. It was a Thursday evening. Gracie already in her room, Edna asleep in the living room chair, with the television at the low murmur she preferred. Ray sat at the kitchen table with a piece of paper, the kind of unlined paper that comes in a printer ream because that was what was available, and a pen, and he wrote without drafting, without crossing out, because the things he was writing had been composing themselves in him for longer than he'd known. He wrote to Gracie about the Tuesday morning in the boardroom. He told her what he'd seen when he looked through the glass panel. Not the drama of it, but the arithmetic 9 people, and the silence of 11 seconds, and the decision that the silence required. He told her that he hadn't felt brave. He had felt scared and had done it anyway, which was not the same as bravery, but was, he thought, the more useful condition. He told her that he had thought about her, that the thought of her had not made him careful as he might have expected it, had made him certain, which was different and better. He wrote, "The floor is not your permanent address, not for anyone. The floor is where you start or where they try to put you, and neither of those things is the same as where you end up." He wrote, "I used to think that being invisible was the price of being where I was. I was wrong. Invisible was the condition they needed me to stay in. The moment I stopped staying in it, even by accident, everything changed. Not all at once, not without cost. But it changed. He wrote, "I love you. That's the reason for everything in this letter. That's the reason for all of it." He folded the paper once and wrote her name on the outside, Gracie, in his handwriting that had always been neater than people expected, and put it in the drawer of the small desk in the corner of the kitchen, the drawer where he kept things that mattered in the low-key way of things that don't need to announce their importance. His phone lit up on the table. A message from Catherine. 3 more organizations want to consult on the model. Boston, Chicago, and a nonprofit consortium in the Mid-Atlantic. I told them they'd need to contact you directly. He picked up the phone and looked at the message. Then he looked at the window above the kitchen sink where the December night was doing what December nights do, pressing in against the glass, holding the interior warmth, accountable for its own existence. He typed back, "Tell them next month. I'm in the middle of something." The response came in under a minute. "What are you in the middle of?" He set the phone on the table and looked at the folded piece of paper in the drawer. He thought about the empty floor on the 8th level and the light it held in the mornings and the things that were being built in it by people who understood from the inside what needed building. He thought about Curtis with the folded approval form. He thought about Joan Pruitt identifying the shortest path between need and resource with the quiet efficiency of a person whose competence had never required an audience. He thought about Edna on the plane asleep, going somewhere she had not been in years because somewhere had become possible again. He picked up the phone. He typed, "Being here." He sent it. He put the phone in his shirt pocket close and went to check that Gracie's light was off and found that it was, and stood for a moment in the doorway of her room in the dark, listening to the sound of her breathing. The city outside was doing what it always did, its traffic and its freight trains, and its early morning deliveries and its 1,000 varieties of human persistence, the whole unglamorous necessary work of a place that continues whether or not any specific person within it is seen. He had been part of that work for years without attribution. He was still part of it. What had changed was not the work, but the terms, not what he gave, but whether what he gave was received. He had saved someone's life. He had nearly lost his own. He had been given through the agency of a woman who had looked at a piece of security footage and decided she was not going to be the person who looked away a floor with windows and the authority to build something on it that had not existed before. These were not small things. He went back to the kitchen and made himself a cup of coffee and sat at the table in the quiet of the apartment in the city of Philadelphia in a life that was not finished yet, that was in fact at one of its actual beginnings, and let the night be what it was, ordinary, unhurried, and entirely sufficient.